because of the treaties that apply or we are signatory to, as you know, that treaties are constitutionally protected. They are part of the United States Constitution. So in Indian country, we like to think that, those treaties, basically supersede anything within our territories. Of course, a lot of people will disagree with us. But, the Chippewa tribes, as you may well know, have the ability to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territories of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And those treaty rights were been affirmed by the Boyd case out west, maybe Bolt. So when you are doing work within the ceded territories, I know we were talking about, Melinda brought up the pesticide or herbicide use underneath the transmission lines. That's very important. There might have been some medicinal plants that were associated with that power line that maybe a tribal elder was utilizing for generations. Providing health benefits to themselves. Maybe their sons and daughters, and maybe their grandbabies. So when you are thinking about off reservation, and our territory in Wisconsin starts from the upper 1/3 of Wisconsin. So any activity that might be occurring in that area, you should be taking into consideration the impacts you might be having on treaty resources. We're impacted quite a bit on off reservation by just mercury deposition, CO2. Greenhouse gases, herbicides, pesticides, and not only in agriculture, pheromones, for example, now using in the gypsy moth. Those are having impact on ceded territory as well as on reservation lands. So it's really very important for federal and state agencies that are doing work within Indian country, is that they have a really good understanding of where those treaty resources are and take those into consideration when you're making your designs or your management plans or whatever your activity is in our ceded territories.
Well, Oneida, like Stockbridge, is in a bit of a unique situation. We're not from Wisconsin, we're from New York, and we were fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of some of the ceded territory from Menominee. So as far as our off-reservation rights go, we don't have a dog in that fight, but we do fortunately have really great working relationships with both Brown and Outagamie County. And the reservation straddles both of those counties, so on the ground level, our environmental staff also works on non-tribal land within the reservation boundaries and also wants to undertake more efforts outside of the reservation for environmental restoration projects. But again, as far as off-reservation rights, we don't push those issues because our reservation was established here out of ceded territory from Menominee.
Yeah, and our situation is very similar, so we didn't adjudicate. We tried to win that fight, but from an Omni standpoint, one thing we do is that the ability to get involved in federal projects that are outside of reservation, to keep sort of a watchdog approach on those, like Army Corps of Engineers, nationwide permitting. They send notices out for most of their activities, individual permitting, and we get notification to Army Corps, this is the area we're interested in finding out what activities are going on. We want to be involved in the comment periods and the ability to get involved in those areas. So most of the map that I showed you earlier is kind of the area that we say we want notices for all your activities in them areas and reserve the right to comment in those activities. So policy and procedurally, that's something that we try to do and keep up on. Other things that you all are already aware of are things that protect it through NHPA, NAGPRA. I mean, Menominee is about to have a repatriation here in a couple of weeks. 5 ancestors are coming home, and those are from places that weren't on the reservation. That activities created disturbance, and we're able to reclaim those artifacts and our ancestors, bring them home, designated site within the Menominee where we're placing all of those ancestors now. Those kinds of things are what we're trying to do to keep up on off-reservation activities.
Becky, I might put you on the spot. So, I thought in the Montana case, there was some wiggle room off reservation in that if the impact was coming off reservation but was on or near, and the near is the word, that, for example, water's flowing, from private lands off reservation onto reservation, you might have some jurisdiction or some say in that. Is that?
Yeah, but I mean, especially in the environmental arena, everything is so interconnected, and you can't just have, it's not like you're building a house and it's an activity limited to here. You're talking about waterways and airways and all of those different things. I mean, it's kind of a gross analogy, but I think of it as like a peeing section of a swimming pool. It just doesn't happen. It goes everywhere. So when you talk about anything, sorry. But so sure, I mean, in Montana, the underlying presumption was sure if it's your tribal land, you have the jurisdiction. It's what if it's not? So yeah, if it is off reservation and that activity is still impacting the tribe's health, safety, or welfare, the tribe could make an argument as to why it should be able to regulate those activities. But again, now is not the time to try to test those cases in court, because if anybody's keeping an eye on the cases dealing with Indian law, we're losing left and right. Which, wait, by the way, last Friday, we got a decision in a case, and I just thought I'd take a few seconds. This is, Hobart filed a lawsuit against the tribe filed a lawsuit against the village of Hobart for stormwater management on the Oneida Reservation. They were imposing taxes on our land to try to create some type of stormwater management system. Some of the land that they were taxing was even our stormwater retention pond that treated their property. So the Eastern District of Wisconsin ruled against them, and it went to the 7th Circuit, and the 7th Circuit issued a decision last Friday recognizing that the village has no authority to try to regulate tribal property on the reservation. So a small victory for Indian country, but in general, now is not the time to try to be testing these cases. We did have to bring this because they were actually threatening title to our land with foreclosure notices. So we had to do something to try to protect our rights.
Thank you. Other questions?
Forgive me for my cold. First and foremost, regardless of it's on reservation or off reservation, NHPA said that you have to consult the tribes if there are any impacts to cultural resources. And I think that's just kind of the focus seems to be just what's happening on reservation and if it's anywhere. And I think with DOT, we've established our areas of interest, and I know tribes are trying to make sure that other agencies are aware of those areas of interest. But that government-to-government consultation must occur if the tribe indicates that there are any impacts. I wanted to share a story very briefly about something that I never would consider, but just talking about the way we were talking about pesticides and herbicides and how those might impact cultural resources. I attended a conference called the George Wright Society in New Orleans a couple of years ago, and I met a couple that worked for the Yosemite National Park, and they had talked about their prescribed burdens that they do at this park, and they've done it for years, and their tribal members have rights to go over there and harvest and gather some of their grasses that they use for weaving baskets and such. And some tribal members had expressed some concerns with how they were doing the prescribed burdens because the chemical that they were using like these fires, could impact the grass that's gonna grow afterwards. And what they were concerned with is the chemical that they use is in this grass, and how they weave is they use their mouth, they wet the grass, they run it through their lips as they're weaving their baskets. And it was something that was never considered. And so there was a lot of pushback from the park, like, well, this is how we gotta do it. And we're like, well, no, we can probably do it in another way. You know, let's consult, let's talk about this. There's gotta be another option. And essentially what it came down to it is they offered to come and do the burn how they had traditionally done it, which they literally carried fire that was made naturally, you know, using what they've done traditionally, and brought it to these areas. And ironically enough, when they started doing this fire in this way, they reintroduced a berry that hadn't been in the area for years and years and years. So it was pretty ironic that they were helping protect their current cultural resource, and thus doing something in a traditional manner, had reintroduced a berry that was native to them that they hadn't had in that area for many, many, many years. So I think there's something to be said about that. That maybe modern day practices aren't the best and maybe the cheapest or the quickest way, but we could be in essence destroying something or preventing something from happening, from growing, or what have you. I just wanted to say that.
And to add to that, the fire, when it's started by certain methods, is more controllable, but it also goes more hot. And some of the seed bank that's in the soil is sensitive and will only germinate in a certain range of temperature. And so when these traditional methods of burning were introduced, the mosaics of the burns over the years never got hot enough because the fuel never grew up enough, which then triggered some of these seeds and these seed banks of plants that hadn't been seen since the park had taken over the place. These plants weren't on their plant list. And so it was very interesting, and exactly how you traditionally view the burn is exactly how you get these plants to germinate out of the seed bank. And in Redwood National Park, where I worked for a while, well, Yurok tribe next to Redwood, we were doing traditional burns in these slow burn mosaics, and we were getting plants coming out that some elders had heard about it and never ever seen, and had actually substituted other plants in the weaving. Here they were coming out of the ground for the first time, and Park Service was just astonished that could happen. But it all had to do with how you traditionally burn. You know, and I think it goes to the ripple effect. It's not just a ripple in one resource, but ecologically it ripples throughout an environment. Other questions for our panel?
I think the assumption, and I might be wrong about this, is that when we send our tribal letters to the tribes for our projects, it's probably getting disseminated to Northern Cultural Resources, and I'm not sure if that's happening. Do you guys ever see those letters that describe our projects before we start working on them, so that we can get your input at that time? So a bridge replacement, you know, near a reservation or things like that?
From Oneida, our point to begin is the land commission. So once the land commission finds out about a project, that elected body should disseminate that information to other departments, because especially if it's going to be impacting tribal property, we need to start the process to approve the request to come onto tribal property. So that involves a number of different departments. So by default, if you're coming on a tribal property, the permission process requires a variety of different areas to know about that. So in the case of Oneida, yes, as long as you start with the land commission, sometimes, again, people will start with our business committee, and that's not where you start, and things may not get to where they need to go.
These are for projects off reservation, but within ceded territory or adjacent territory. So we send letters on all of our projects, whether they're on reservation or not. And those are the ones that kind of introduce our projects. And they go to all the historic preservation offices.
Can't recall seeing if there was an activity that occurred in, DOT road going up on Highway 2 in National County. I don't remember seeing that kind of letter. I would suggest that, it would be good to, go ahead and write a tribal nation that is associated with an activity in an area, ceded or otherwise. But, I don't recall that happening.
Yeah, no, me neither. I mean, projects on res, certainly we're getting good communication on those, but the other ones, if you're sending them to TIPO, they're going to TIPO. We don't depend on TIPO to share that info with us, because TIPO's desks are stacked with stuff this big. We don't want to overburden them at all, so, I think some of the things, Rosie, would be accountable and fixable and in an agreement. And that's why I, for Menominee, would like to sit down and talk about what kinds of things can we do similar to what we have with DNR and address some of these things. Because no, we're not seeing those.
And I think it would be real easy for us to add a CC to those letters to the natural resources or lands department or whoever would be the appropriate person. And basically, it's a letter introducing the project. And I know Sandy and the other tribal liaisons have regular meetings with the tribe to talk about the upcoming projects, but I don't know how that is getting disseminated within the tribe either. And I know those letters used to go to the chair, tribal chair, or president, but they stopped sending them to them because they weren't getting to the TIPOs. So I think most of them now go directly to the TIPOs. And that might assist us in recognizing some of these other needs. Because, we're replacing bridges all over the place and working on bridges all over the place. So if they're on your water resources, and I know we did coordinate with you, Larry, on 182, which was off the reservation, but it was adjacent to it. So we wanted to make sure, and there's wild rice there, that we coordinated with you on that one. But that was just because I had a really good project designer on it. And he said something to me about it, and I'm like, yeah, do that.
Like when there's a state, in the state forest, when there's cuts that are going to be within the ceded territories, we get a list of where those cuts are going to be. So, for example, if there's going to be birch, there gives the tribal membership an opportunity to go ahead and harvest that birch even before it gets cut down, kind of thing. And at least in terms of the Chippewa tribes, maybe a letter to the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission would be helpful, and they can get that information out to their Ojibwe task force representatives as another option. So that might be helpful.
You had mentioned earlier about only being a small number of tribes in the United States that are federally recognized for water quality, and you have Lac du Flambeau, Bad River, and Menominee going in that direction. From the Menominee point of view, what do you hope to gain? What do you hope to get out of this? And I'm curious as to what downfalls there may be and why only so few are doing it.
Gretchen might be a better person in this. Does anybody else want to try that first? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to refer to Gretchen as well. She's got experience. But I think from the, I guess your last part of your question first is weighing the benefits, the pros and the cons. One of the cons I think that jumps out at tribes immediately is capacity building. you have to have capacity in order to implement these programs. So it's not an easy task because it requires funding. And we are always looking for funding, all of us, no matter what activity we undertake. So that's the first thing I think that I look at in talking with my director already about what are we going to do when we get to step 3. We need to start planning for step 20. And that's the biggest thing right now for us is looking at capacity. But I'm sure Gretchen has better examples than I do.
I know it's a pretty long process. You know, I think we started 1986. We obtained our status in about 1998. Our status was taken away because there was a quote-unquote fudging or a finding of fact. The EPA basically told us that, you know, narrative water quality standards were good. And then we got narrative water quality standards that were drafted. And they said, well, no, maybe we should go with numerical water quality standards. So we went ahead and spent the time on numerical water quality standards. And at the same time, didn't get our treatment as a state, what they call treatment as a state, which gives, to be quite honest with you, a lot of the tribes a diaper rash because, you know, they want to be treated as a state, you know, they want to be treated as sovereign. So there's a little, but the Clean Water Act basically says it's treatment as a state, so that's something that terminology is used. And that might put off, you know, some, you know, tribes even trying. It's a process that's very costly, time consuming. There's a lot of information that needs to be collected before you could even set your water quality standards. So, you know, on the Lackawanna Indian Reservation, we basically had a lot of our lakes, you know, that needed, you know, baseline water quality data that needed to be collected in order to figure out, you know what our standard should be. So it's a time-consuming process. Has to go through the federal process. In our particular case, I think it was Governor Doyle and Congressman Green it became a gubernatorial kind of problem because the non-Indian community within the Lackawanna Indian Reservation basically thought that, quote unquote, we can't have the tribes, you know, regulate us. There's no way we're going to let the guy. It's like, you know, taxation without representation, that kind of thing, that kind of an attitude. So they really put up a fight, you know, because they thought we were going to try to not, you know, cause them to put in their boat motors and piers and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, Congressman Green at the time really made it a difficult road to hoe. We had Governor Doyle basically ready to sign off because the governor has to sign off on this once the EPA makes the determination. And it almost got lost in that shuffle. So it's there's a lot of that kind of stuff, that jurisdictional issues with the non-Indian community, those kinds of things. And you know, it really cost us a lot of time, pain, effort, money in order to bring that around. And it wasn't an easy process, but we did learn from that process. So once you get treatment as a state, you need to get your water quality standards approved. And that's a whole different process. You know, and all, you know, public hearings and all that kind of stuff comes into play. We engaged the non-Indian community right up front when that process started. So Gretchen, do you have anything to add on that? Or? Okay. So, you know, it's a time-consuming process. In our particular case, it's well worth the effort because now any water that's coming onto the reservation has to meet our standards. And that's very, very important when you start to look at the increase in mining activity that's been occurring within the ceded territories in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. You know, it's very, very important to have that kind of protection. Air designation is another one. So if Bad River gets it, Potawatomi has it, you know, they have that sort of, you know, I think Lactaflamma is right where they meet. So, you know, it's going to be something that would be protective of our resources. So.
If there are no other questions, and we probably have 10 minutes before lunch, 12 minutes, something like that, 18 minutes, why don't we move into and use the next 18 minutes or so to do cultural exchange.